everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I want to reflect a little bit on my writer's journey. This bit of self-reflection was prompted by my latest book, which is my 6th book. I am writing it right now. I am struggling with it a bit. Actually, right now I'm kind of in a good phase, but as you've seen in my vlogs, I've been having to really interrogate my writing process, try different things. And there are things that I couldn't necessarily have done in the beginning, which was 7, 8, 9 years ago when I was making that transition from being an aspiring writer, wanting to write novels, to writing novels, and those first few books that I did write. I think some of the fun of AuthorTube and generally following authors who you admire, who you find interesting, is kind of seeing a journey, seeing a transition, hearing them talk about kind of the ways in which they changed and leveled up. I certainly enjoy that, and experiencing it myself, I'm like, it's just really fascinating to reflect on your own journey and go, wow, because the thing that the wisdom you gain and the things that you learn, and this is definitely how I approach mentorship, for example, is often you just have to let yourself as the writer be what you are in the moment. And it feels very vivid and real because it literally is. And it feels very absolute in the moment that you experience it. And all you can do for yourself as a writer is be where you are at that moment and serve yourself in that moment. But we think it's always gonna be like this. This is how it is. I could never. And I love the idea of looking back because it's like 8, 9 years ago me, even 5, 6 years ago me, before I had a book deal, would just never fathom some of the changes, some of the leveling up that has happened. So I thought it would be fun to reflect. This is not the first time I've done reflection. It's been 2.5 years, almost 3 years, since I did a comparison between the experiences of writing my first book versus writing my 4th book, and I will link to that down below. A couple of the things, like I went back and rewatched it, are the same, but I mean, think about it. I posted that toward the end of 2018, which was my debut year as I was writing that 4th book, editing that 4th book, and now I'm a thriller writer. I've pivoted my career, I've leveled up even more, and I'm doing things now, writing book 6, I couldn't have done on book 4. So just thought it'd be fun to go over it a bit. So one thing that I really had to fight as a baby writer, as I refer to myself when I was aspiring, when I was new to finishing books, was fighting perfectionism. And this is where all of that advice comes from, advice that I still give and stand by, of you have to fight perfectionism in order to push through and in order to finish. And part and parcel with that for me and for many is forming a writing habit, learning to push through when you're unsure about your writing. And so one specific thing that to compare and contrast, I used to drink when I wrote, which makes me sound like a Hemingway alcoholic, and I wasn't, but it was kind of like a reward system kind of thing, because I like red wine, and it was, you have your glass of red wine when you do your writing session, and it kind of became a Pavlov's dog kind of thing. And honestly, that kind of ritual, sometimes I would throw in cookies, a very specific brand of cookies that I would have when I was writing. Those were literal cookies, the wine also being a cookie, to get me in the writing headspace, to create that habit. And that's just not something that I do anymore. I'd say my first 2 books, that really was a part of the ritual. It was, you know, it's the glass of wine when I was writing, and yes, that was not great for mostly for my weight. So not something you can keep up if writing takes place over a very long period of time. And since like my 3rd book for sure, but like certainly 4, 5, 6, I just don't do that anymore. I don't even really snack when I write. I don't need those sorts of cookies, literal cookies sometimes, anymore in order to sit down and do that writing. And overall, that is a huge transition from baby writer to now. And it's just the difference between when you're aspiring or you're a hobbyist writer and becoming a pro writer, whether you are published or not. But it's this switch that you get to eventually. And this is why I give that kind of not so popular advice that writer's block isn't real, which I've made a whole clarifying video about so that you understand what I mean by that. And part of what I mean by that is when you have to write, you figure out how to write when you're not inspired. There are all sorts of times when you can't write for a variety of reasons, but you can't really tie the idea of being productive to the mythical idea of being inspired to write. And it is pushing through kind of, you know, there's a day you just can't, you're not feeling it, but you echo out that 200 words anyway, and it doesn't really matter if it sucks. And I've come a long way in terms of that. I don't have a problem sitting down, flipping the writing switch. I've done it enough that I'm confident that I can do it. And kind of related to that perfectionism. So another thing, this is the big one that's been like a moment for me as I've been vlogging the process of book 6. So if you've watched the vlogs, you'll know some of this. When I was a baby writer, one of the biggest hurdles for me, and it's a hurdle for a lot of people, and so this is also one of my favorite go-to pieces of advice for novice writers, aspiring writers, which is do not edit as you go. There are some writers who can do this, and we'll get to the second half of it in a minute, but like by and large, when you're new, this can be just a great procrastination tool for never finishing a book. It's the perfectionism thing again. And for me especially, because I prefer revision to drafting, which I'm also going to talk more about, it was really essential to fight that perfectionism, to not edit as I went and barrel through a draft. Like I had to go and have to go full steam ahead, write as often as possible, don't skip days. So when I'm actively drafting, I mean, we're talking months of daily writing. I can't take long breaks. You know, I break the flow. Basically I can't get into the mentality of, oh, I really want to start fixing it, or I'll lose momentum and I won't finish the book. Or at least that's what it was like in the past. And for my first 5 books, that held true. Though, as I've also talked about process-wise in some videos, a thing that I did on all 5 of those books was I got to like the 90% point of the manuscript, so right before, it was usually right after the climax. But for the ending, I would stop, I'd run out of steam inevitably, go back to the beginning, do my first pass revision, and then finish the book. And so that was like my little cheat that I managed to balance and make work. Well, on the 6th book, I've leveled up. I mean, at least it's worked on this book. I don't know if it's gonna be permanent going forward on other books, but I was able to stop in the middle. The earliest I have ever stopped in a manuscript and go back to the beginning, to Act 1, which was just bothering me so much, and revise it, and then jump seamlessly back to where I left off. And knock on wood, it hasn't been a problem. I'm at the break into 3. I'm almost in Act 3. So I was able to go back to the middle of Act 2 and just keep going. And I needed to do that editing in order to move into this next phase. And yeah, 8 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I literally couldn't have done that. The fear was always that I would lose my momentum and give up on the book, stop writing the book. So that for me represents like a huge shift, a huge change, a huge leveling up. So the next thing, this one's funny because this is also one that I give advice on, because like genuinely another major hurdle to me writing and finishing books was the constant need for external validation. And this in large part came from my background in fandom, where well, first of all, everything is shorter and you post them more frequently, but also there's a culture of beta readers who like now, like I think of them as alpha readers, but everyone was a beta reader in fandom at the time, where you would have writer friends who would read everything you wrote as you were writing it. It was really common to have those sorts of symbiotic relationships. I had them with other people, they had them with me. And you get really used to like, I'm gonna write a chapter and I'm gonna send it to my beta and they're gonna tell me it's great and like cheer me on, and I'm gonna use that to continue writing. It can work in fandom, and it just doesn't work like that usually when you break into the big bad world of original fiction novel writing, especially your first novel. It's just hard to find people who have the organic interest in reading as you write, but B who are on the exact same timeline as you. It's kind of like, it's a timing thing often, where you're going to lose momentum on your drafting if you're waiting 3 weeks at a time for someone to read a chunk of your writing and wait for some sort of stamp of approval. So what you have to learn to do, and what I had to learn to do, was it's like self-soothing, self-cheerleading, to basically have the confidence to be okay with whatever decision I made and whatever that chapter or scene was, and move forward. Keep going. Complete a whole draft before you send it to a person to get their feedback. And it can take a lot of trial and error and practice to learn to do that. And what's hilarious to me now, so I continue to give that advice to newer writers. If that is something you're struggling with, you just have to suck it up and push through it. You have to learn to not have that kind of cheerleader beside you reading as you write, constant feedback. What's funny is now I have that. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Like, you kind of have to get over that hurdle and learn to do it on your own, and then kind of get into the writing publishing world and establish those writer relationships and CP relationships. And then down the line, you might have a person who can do that. And so I do have an alpha reader, the irony, on my current thriller, and I had one on the IVs. I've had one on almost every book. Maybe not reading the entire time, but I now have people who I know if I ask them to read, they can read within a few hours or a few days a section. And it's not like chapter to chapter. I tend to do it in chunks, but now I feel like kind of guilty. I'm like, oh, I'm telling people they can't do this, because it's just like, it's harder. It's just harder to find people organically invested in your novice novel writing, essentially original novel writing. Fandom people are already invested in what you're writing, and also the requirements of the writing level a little different. I say that with love to fanfic, but you level up when you start writing novels, usually, or you should. But like now I'm on book 6 and I'm a clean drafter. My 0 drafts, I mean, they're messy in their own special way, but they're pretty clean. Like, I can hand it to an alpha reader and just take the temperature. And that's mostly what it is. And honestly, it really helps me write thrillers. I just feel so guilty. So that's like it's almost like a regression, but in a good way. So the next thing is kind of funny. It's the craft stuff. We're gonna talk about the craft stuff. I feel like I've been on a journey, and in large part because of this channel. So having to make craft videos on this channel, that makes me sound like someone forced me to, but I mean, people asked for them and I was like, well, I'll challenge myself to talk about these things. And I started out by making videos on the things that I knew were personal weaknesses, because I can talk about things that I am not good at and kind of discuss, well, these are the things you can do. And some of them I'd already been doing by the time I started this channel, but it's just the darndest thing as you write and you give your work to CPs and you write multiple books and you get feedback and you get rejections, and even once you're published and you work editorially with your editor, you learn your weaknesses. And the best advice is, it's not about being the best writer ever, you know, born and being great at all things about writing, but understanding what you are good at, leaning into the things that you are good at, and then in a targeted way, bit by bit, not all at once, over many years and many books, you fix or you improve your weaknesses. So baby writer me, hardcore awful at white room syndrome. Also issues with telling and showing. I default to a telling style because of my background in journalism and just it's just my writing style. We have our writing styles. And so over years and years and years, just I've actively worked on, especially like in revision at first, but now it's like I want to do it right when I draft. I think I've come leaps and bounds. I still, like, those are still like inherent weaknesses that I have, and especially if I'm struggling on a draft and I'm fighting perfectionism, I'll say F it. And I'll basically like write a white room, like I'll write like a dialogue exchange that just doesn't have much going on. I'll skip my action tags and I will fix it later. But by and large, I do feel, again, let's knock on wood, aspects of craft that were previously weaknesses, I've definitely improved on, especially, like, I still default to a telling style, but telling isn't all bad. I mean, I've made lots of videos about those sorts of things and many readers like that style, and there's a difference between the kind of telling that puts a ton of distance between the reader and the writing and is painful to read, and like more of a narrative style that you can kind of work around your own natural inclinations to infuse your line level prose with interesting details and make it feel evocative and specific. And I have pointedly, like, I've really tried to get better at that. I want to write line level beautiful prose, maybe not purple prose, but I want to have some nice line level writing. And I have some lines from my last couple books that like I'm genuinely like, that's not bad. And I look back and I'm like, I feel I've improved as a writer. And like, you should. That should be a natural kind of result of writing a bunch of books over a lot of time. But not everyone does do that work. And I don't mean that to sound like salty. We're all a little different, but that is in large part why, you know, it's not just aspiring or novice writers who need advice. All writers on a continuum need advice. And the biggest advice as you are moving up and leveling up that, you know, I had to actually do myself, like not just like spouting the advice, but doing it, is being really harsh with yourself when you know that there are specific craft related things that you are not as strong at, and specific examples that I know I'm much better at. And this is thanks in large part to my editors I've worked with at publishers, and just going through the line, copy, and pass page process on multiple books with different teams at different publishers. But like, it's frustrating in the moment, but like the more anal retentive your copy editor is or your editor is, I feel there's greater potential for you to level up as a writer, because you have to actually sit down and go, which hills am I willing to die on versus, oh, they're right, my writing is weaker because of this thing, and I have chosen to interrogate where my writing is weaker and could be better. And specifically, like the editors I've worked with who have really helped me with echoes / crutch words, crutch phrases, cliches, like really kind of catching when I have like, they're almost like tics, like repetitive, like we all have these comfort words and phrases and modes of expression and metaphor that are just comfortable, especially in drafting, to vomit onto the page, especially because I don't like drafting as much. Basically taking yourself to task for where you've been a little lazier with your writing. And I feel that I've leveled up, because now as I am drafting, even on the days when it's hard and I'm fighting perfectionism, I'm like, just get words on the page. Sometimes I do knowingly write a cliche or a crutch, something that I know I'm gonna have to edit later. But a good half the time I go, no, like dig deep inside and find a better way to express this, even if it means I spend a little bit longer on a sentence or a paragraph or a section, but it makes my drafts better. So the next like marked change, or that like I feel, I don't know if, I mean, it's tricky to know if readers notice this, because how well do you know me? I've talked about self-inserts before. I made a whole video on it, and I stand by this. I feel you get 100% self-insert main character, and it's usually your first book. You have to get it out of your system, and it is easier to write someone who literally sees, feels, thinks exactly like you. And I got that out of my system on my first book. My first book that I ever wrote that didn't sell, she was a self-insert, like teenage me, a version of teenage me. And I've challenged myself on every single book since not to do that. And so it's just been working over many books. And in fairness, part of what facilitated this in a weird way is that once I wrote my first 2 unpublished books, which were original, so to speak, and then I wrote retellings, which are retellings, so they're based on existing source material, and specifically the character blueprints of my heroines existed. That was actually a really great challenge for me, that I had to write to someone else's character archetype blueprint. And specifically, I didn't do this on purpose. I mean, that they're two famously, supposedly passive characters, though I would argue that their agency lies in different areas. But regardless, to write modern YA retellings of these beloved classics for passive-ish characters, I had to give them agency that they didn't necessarily have in their original stories, but they still had to feel like those characters, and both of them are characters who are not me, so that was nice. And then on my thrillers, well, so this is kind of the new challenge and growth. Again, we're gonna knock on wood a ton in this video. What I'm currently doing right now is really challenging myself for the first time, because even when you're not writing a blatant self-insert, and what you should be doing is dispersing your personal qualities and points of view to different characters. That's just what writers do, because we can only see the world as ourselves, and we write based on things that we know. And there's only so much projection outside of yourself you can do. And that's just kind of accepting reality and like not being too hard on yourself. But something that I've done book after book after book, both consciously and unconsciously, and this isn't uncommon, I have anxiety. It both informs my life in very clear ways and doesn't. But once I started writing main characters, and you're writing a POV of someone and how they view the world and how they, the assumptions that they make about stimuli and how they react to things. And I write anxious protagonists over and over again. Some more consciously anxious than others. So in the Ivies, Olivia is purposefully anxious because honestly, anxious heroines or heroes can do a lot in a thriller. Take it or leave it. I like reading about anxious people in thrillers because it's like, oh, that's how I would react to that too. Like, it can serve the story, and I knew that she was anxious, and so I didn't work as hard to dial it back. I wouldn't say necessarily dialed it up too much. I dialed it up a little. But this new book, I'm trying. We'll see how I do. I'm actively trying to write a main character, a POV main character, who doesn't have the anxiety that I have, the type of anxiety that I have. I think that murder books, situations with murder, always create a certain kind of anxiety, situational anxiety, but I'm trying to write someone who doesn't, make the same assumptions that I would make about how other people behave, who doesn't react in kind of a defensive manner, who is far better at taking risks and letting certain social things kind of slide off their back. Basically, I'm trying to write a much more chill person than I am, a more normative, if you will. And that's a fun challenge, and I think I've come a long way. Like, I think that I'm starting to really stretch myself in terms of my characters because I'm 6 books in. And also, like, especially once you start being published, you shouldn't want your characters to be the same in every single book. You don't want readers to be like, wow, they literally write the same main character over and over and over again. I really hope I don't do that. And so there's growth there, but there's continuing challenge there as well to try to write outside of my own personal defaults. And then just kind of, I guess this is kind of crafty again, but like, I feel like my Act 2s, they're always messy, they're always hard. I think this is the case for all writers, even once you're more advanced, so to speak. But I don't know, this new book, I feel like my middle's a little better. Even the Ivies, while I did do work to that middle because I was threading some new stuff through it, structurally it was still pretty solid. And this new one feels structurally pretty solid, so I'm hoping that means that's something I have more organically and naturally improved at over time. Though, frankly, if you compare how I structure and write my Act 2s now to my first book, anything's an improvement. We're all allowed to be complete garbage on our first book, so yeah. And then endings. Endings are a constant struggle for me. Though, in fairness, that's partly, like, this is the whole like thing of paying attention to your reviews and like letting certain things kind of get under your skin. I personally was happy with the endings of my first 2 books that were published. I like them, they satisfy me, but they were a little polarizing and some people didn't like them. And so I made a very concerted effort on the Ivy to really interrogate my own biases, potential weaknesses. I went back and forth with my editor, and I'm really happy with the ending. And while there are people who still don't like the ending, but I knew that they wouldn't because I made some choices that I knew not everyone would like, personally, I am proud of it from like a character and a pacing point of view. I could have made it even longer, but I hope it works for people. And I've heard some feedback from people that I trust who said, no, like it had the denouement. Like if I'm gonna go on and on about that darn thing, I'd better have one. And while I haven't written the ending of this new one, I have reasonable confidence that like I feel like I've learned enough that I'm not gonna land it in one. I never land it in one, but hopefully like it'll get like one good revision and I will hopefully do it decently well and be happy and satisfied with it. I do like generally have an idea of like, I think it's gonna be okay. I have more of an idea of where it ends than I did of the Ivies when I started, so I think the big question in terms of reflecting on a writing journey over the course of, I think it's technically 9 years since I tried to start writing the novel that eventually I finished. That was my first book. And it's been 5 years since I got my second agent, and it's been 4 years since I sold my debut, 3 years since it came out, and I'm writing my 6th book, which will be my 4th book for publication. That's confusing. Am I still a pantser? And yes, I am. When you think fundamentally about my writing process, it really hasn't changed that much. I actually think the fundamental difference is, was I ever really a pantser? And really the problem is with the dichotomy and how we talk about this. I've definitely never been an outliner and will probably never be an outliner, just in the traditional sense of like, I will never plan every single detail, scene, beat of my story ahead of time. The joy that I get out of discovery writing, and this comes back to, I don't love drafting. I love it more than I used to, but I love editing. I love drafting because I know I get to edit. And so I have to have a discovery writing process. I have to sit down to every writing session, more or less, to scenes and chapters and sections of the book and feel really excited about what I'm gonna write. And when I plan too much ahead of time, too far ahead of time, that just doesn't happen. I need a little bit of that by the seats action to feel alive, basically. And it's also just how I generate a lot of really good ideas. Yes, does it mean that I have to edit things? Yes, but I still really enjoy it. I'm doing it right now. I'm at that point at the end of Act 2 going into Act 3, and this happened earlier in the week where I knew I had to have something happen. There had to be some sort of discovery, right? It's a thriller. And I made the snap decision to do something kind of crazy, to be honest. And yes, it produces ripples, but I don't care. It was so exciting writing it, and it was like exactly what I needed to do to push me through to the next section, the break into 3, going into the climax, that I'm excited about the work that I have to do to just kind of thread it through. And I don't know if it's necessarily something that I would have arrived at had I not had this process. Like every book, there's at least one thing, like a light bulb kind of moment that happens that is just so juicy and fun that I never would have come up with otherwise. So that aspect of my process simply hasn't changed. But I've always had signposts. If writing is a map and if we're on a road trip, I've always had some bits on the map, places that I knew that I wanted to stop. I've never just started a book with no clue what was gonna happen. I always need some sort of structure. I've always had some sort of structure. So really, I'm a plantser if we wanna kind of use that spectrum, but really I'm a discovery writer. And I think that this is partly down to how we like define these things. It's just kind of reductive and easiest to say plotter versus pantser, ha 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 ha. But really, I think I've always been in the middle and I remain in the middle. Now, I do have to do a lot more, like, I guess there are a few more stops on the map than maybe there used to be. So I've had books or earlier books where maybe I didn't 100% know that, you know, I was gonna end up spending a week in Las Vegas on my way to California. But like, that's where I ended up and it worked out well. Definitely now that I write thrillers, the ending is super definitive. I'm going on a road trip and I'm not just going to California, I'm going to Los Angeles and I'm gonna stop in Chicago, and I plan a lot more of that last part. So I know that I'm gonna go to Vegas and Phoenix and like, you know, the piece, I'm just like randomly spouting Southwestern geography. I know that ahead of time in a way that I haven't always known that on every book, but that is a lot about the genre that I'm writing now, thrillers. Though we'll see if I go back to writing sci-fi or I write a fantasy, perhaps the work that I've done in writing thrillers, because I just find that I can't write them unless I work backwards. That's just how my process works on thrillers. We'll see if it informs that. But that's like the biggest change. I'm still planting, I'm still discovery writing. It gives me joy and life. But I plan more of kind of the conflict linchpins because of how thrillers work as a genre than I have in the past. But I really think it's more of a progression of the types of books that I'm writing, but it's definitely interesting. But there are definitely authors, like professional writers, who will like say like, oh, I wasn't an outliner until I started getting book contracts and writing professionally, and then you have to become an outliner. And I remain stubborn. I just don't see that being me. I mean, the 6th book I'm writing is the most planned book I have ever written. I had to do a proposal, which meant I had to write a full-ass synopsis, a plot overview. So like signpost, right? And I gave it to my editor. But what's fascinating, which is what I love about the discovery process, so much of the stuff bubbling under the surface, because a synopsis is purposefully top line, the texture is so rich and different from anything I could have come up with ahead of time, that even though my editor has basically, she knows all the spoilers for this book, she's read the synopsis, she knows what's going to happen, I still have the potential to delight her, because a lot of the specifics and the texture I've come up with as I have been writing. And yeah, for me, that's the magic. And then to end on this far too long self-aggrandizing video, things that haven't changed, because this other than that whole planting thing, I'm still so slow, like relatively speaking. I'm slower than I'd like to be. The fastest I've ever drafted a book was 3 months, and that was my publishing debut. So that was the 3rd book I wrote, the 1st book that was published. It was like lightning in a bottle. The 2nd fastest I've drafted was The Ivies, which took me like 4 months and change. Shorter book than the one that took me 3 months though. That one I wrote 100,000 words in 3 months. The Ivies was 74,000 words in a little over 4 months. Now this latest book, the 6th book, I had all these like lofty dreams that I had taught myself to write a thriller in 4 months, right? No, this book is taking forever. Every book is different. And I still default to being, relatively speaking, a slow writer. Now that still means like I can write 15 to 20,000 words in a month. You do that enough consistently, and that's based on 500 to 800 to 1,000-ish word counts per day. But honestly, the majority of this book, the 6th book, 500 word, painfully 500 word increments for the majority of this drafting. But if you do that consistently enough, eventually you're gonna end up with a book. So like realistically, I'm a 4 to 6 month draft writer, which is perfectly fine, but I still dream of cracking my own personal code of how to write faster. And I just haven't gotten there yet. Maybe someday. Yeah, and then, as already stated many times, revision remains my favorite. I do like drafting more than I had in the past, in the sense that drafting is hard, but it's not hard in the same ways that it used to be hard, and that's really down to that whole writing habit thing, training myself so I can sit down and I can find my way into progress more easily than I maybe could in the past. And that's just, it's the muscle, the writing muscle. Just you do something enough and you figure out how to do it. And a huge part of that, like, I write things that I find fun. Like, that's how I get through the drafting process. Like, I can't write a book that I'm not excited to write. I can't write a book where the discovery process doesn't bring me that thrill. It's like I need that adrenaline rush. And so that's a huge part of pivoting to thrillers. I genuinely find them fun. And like my cookie system has shifted slightly because of that genre shift, meaning like on my previous books, the romance ones, my cookies were the romance beats that I was really excited to write, especially in the retellings that I did. In thrillers, I'm always writing toward the climax. I am always writing toward the big set piece that I know before I start writing, where like the twists happen and everything falls apart, and like those are my cookies. And that is how I force myself through 50, 60, 70,000 words to get to like the fun part where I get to blow everything up, basically. And that kind of goes to, I start at the end and I know more precisely what happens at the end of my books than I maybe did previously before I started writing thrillers. And then just like little things, I still like, I'm best when I write at night. And that's partly a function of just my life and my day job. I've always been a night owl. Like I was that kid in college. I stayed up till 3 a.m. every night. That's also when I would write fan fiction. Once my homework was done, my studying was done. Homework, I mean, you have homework for college, but it seems really weird to call it that. It sounds so juvenile. So I remain a night writer. Again, there's like this fantasy I have that I know just isn't realistic, that maybe someday I'll be a morning writer. It's not gonna happen. And I'm still ride or die for Scrivener. That is something that has not changed, and it was like such a watershed moment for me in my writing journey. Like getting Scrivener, discovering Scrivener is, I'm convinced, the only reason I ever finished a novel, and it remains indispensable to me. Though I am now a little bit more comfortable doing edits, and thus when you're editing and you write fresh scenes, I do that in Microsoft Word, just because once you transition to working with your editor at your publisher, they tend to stay native in the Word document. So I've just had to like slightly adjust my process there. But drafting, Scrivener is my boo. So after talking about myself for like 40 minutes, I'm gonna stop. But honestly, like this was fun, a little reflection. And what I find most interesting is like the advice that I would give to essentially my younger self hasn't changed, because that was the advice I needed at the time. And this really speaks to the nature of advice. You have to take whatever works for you in the moment that it works for you. But like now that I can really reflect on some pretty marked changes in terms of essentially just leveling up. I've upped my skill level where I can challenge myself in new ways. I can try different things. I can break my process without breaking a book. It's just more confidence than ever that I can experiment and still finish books, which is nice. It kind of just adds like a new dimension to like, now I have, I hope, better advice for people who are more advanced as writers, and certainly better advice for myself and ways that I can push myself to get better at writing. And I want to know, like, if you've been on your writing journey for a while, what is the like biggest change that you noticed in yourself? Like for me, honestly, realizing that I could stop in the middle and go back and revise Act 1 and not fall apart, which happened a few weeks ago, like really a brain busting moment where I was like, this is like evidence of how far I've come. This is bonkers. I mean, even just that I'm tackling the book I'm tackling, because it's incredibly ambitious and very challenging, and so far I haven't like completely face planted. What have those kind of aha moments been for you with your writing? Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I'll make more kind of rambly videos where I egotistically talk about myself and my writing. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.